Okay? So, pollution is a negative externality. Now look at the picture. Don't write down everything else. Just look at this picture. So this picture is a mine tailing pond. If you mine gold or you mine certain other metals, if you know how the world works, when the earth was molten in the deep past, all of the heavier elements fell to the bottom and the light elements were at the top. So things like gold and iron were way down in the ground, and stuff like oxygen and silicon was up high. But as time goes on, mountains form, and the mountains form because of volcanoes, and the mountains form because of tectonic plate movement, and the mountains bring the stuff that's way down in the ground up to the surface. So in mountains we have iron, in mountains we have lead, in mountains we have gold and silver. Okay? You don't mine gold and silver in Nebraska where it's flat. You mine gold and silver in the Rockies and in the mountain areas on the coast of California, okay, in the Sierras. It's in mountains. Now, when you mine gold, you just don't get gold out of the ground. You get gold and all kinds of other stuff with it. And so what you do is you put the rock with the gold in it, there's dirt with the gold in it, into this pond, and the pond is full of water and acids or other chemicals, and out of that gets separated out the gold, but behind that is all of this toxic waste. So there's this pond at every gold mine in the world and every other mine in the world pretty much. There's these tailings ponds that are full of this awful stuff, and if you go to Colorado and you get off of I-70 and you drive some of the scenic routes around, you will occasionally have to drive past one of these, and it's really disgusting that they're there. Okay? This one's in Chile. So they're pulling the gold out, but they don't want any of the other stuff. They don't want all the toxic stuff. They don't want to have to pay to dispose it. So three things happen with this stuff in this tailings pond. So it might just seep down into the groundwater, right? So a tailings pond up in the mountains in Colorado, it might just seep down into the groundwater, and then you drink it for lunch in Denver. Or it might leach into the creeks and streams that run through the mountains, because there's lots of them. And in fact, there's lots of streams and creeks in Colorado that it's really dangerous to drink from because they're full of all this toxic waste from these mines. And you can't see it. Or three, what happens in Chile is they drain these off into the ocean. So everybody in the world can drink it. All right? This is a negative externality. They are not paying the true cost of mining that gold. The true cost of mining that gold includes cleaning up all of this stuff so that other people don't have to clean it up or drink it. Okay? But that's not what happens. So how do you make this right? How do you fix this? Well, there's three general ways that we go about fixing this. So one is to create property rights, and we'll talk about these more here in detail. We got slides on them. To create a property right. People can defend property rights in court. Okay? If I own my house, which I do, and my neighbor decides they want to throw everything from their yard over into my yard, I can call the police, I can call my lawyer, I can go after them because they're putting their stuff on my property. So if the ocean actually belonged to somebody, if we take Poseidon and we say, look, the ocean belongs to you, then Poseidon can sue Chile for dumping this stuff into his ocean. Okay? Number two, we can pass laws that just say, look, you can't do that, you can't dump it in the ocean, this is what you have to do with it. And three, we can put a tax on it or attach a price to it, and then they have to pay either the tax or this price to deal with that, and that will change their behavior. All right, property rights. Again, you have these streams up in the mountains in Colorado. Well, who owns them? Well, technically the state does or the feds do, whether it's a national park. But really, it's the people that there's really no defendable property right in that stream. So when all that pollution flows down into those streams, there's nobody who has legal standing to sue the person who made that crap flow down through this stream. Okay? And there's the backwards problem, which is some of the mines in Colorado are 70 years old, 100 years old, 150 years old, and nobody owns the mine anymore. So even if you owned the stream, you couldn't sue the person who owns the mine because you have no idea who that is. Okay? So if I own the stream and the tailings are headed my way, what can I do? Well, I can go after the person who's putting that stuff in my stream, and they have several choices. One would be that they try to pay me off. They try to give me money for me to go clean up my stream. And if I say, no, I don't want that, I want you to not put stuff in my stream, then they have to use what we call abatement technology, which is they have to catch that stuff somehow and dispose of it before it gets into my stream, or they could produce less. They could shut that mine down because the cost of cleaning up their waste products is more than the value of what they're pulling out of the mine. Okay? So those are their two choices. If, again, there's a property right. If nobody owns that stream, we can't defend it. If I own that stream, they have to take care of me. I can sue them, and I can make them not throw stuff in my stream. Right? And so if they may try to pay me off, and I don't want to get paid off, so they've either got to make stuff not go in or not produce the stuff in the first place. Okay? There are conservation groups like World Wildlife Federation that do this. They go to Africa and they buy land that has elephants on it. Now the elephants belong to them essentially, and they can sue people who come and try to get their elephants. Okay? You can do the same thing if you want to protect, a species in Louisiana that's on the Mississippi. You can buy land in Louisiana that's on the Mississippi, and then you have rights because you're a landowner. Okay? So it's not a bad idea. Now, this idea is related. This dude over here is a man named Ronald Coase. He's dead too. Everybody seems like all these famous economists are dead. But that's Ronald Coase. He invented something that we call the Coase Theorem. What a shock that Ronald Coase would invent the Coase system. Imagine that you have a farmer who lives next door to a cattle rancher. So you have 1,000 acres of farmland on one side of this fence and 1,000 acres of cattle grazing on the other side of the fence. And the cows are like, that corn on the other side of that fence, that looks tasty. Tastier than this grass we're eating over here. And so the cows from the rancher keep breaking down the fence and go over and eating the farmer's corn. Okay? How do we solve that problem? Well, Coase's answer is that we don't really have that big a problem because both the farmer and the rancher own their land. And the rancher owns the cows and the farmer owns the corn. Right? So Pigou, and we'll talk about Pigou more, Pigou would have said, no, the government needs to tax the rancher and fix the fence. Coase, who, again, years later after Pigou, says, as long as there aren't transaction costs, as long as there's not difficulty, it's not expensive to make a contract, the two sides can make a contract themselves that's optimal, right? That the government, if they come in, they won't be able to make an optimal solution. They'll make a solution, but it might not be optimal. Maybe the rancher just needs to buy out the farmer and have 2,000 acres of grazing land instead of 1,000. Maybe the farmer just agrees to sell his corn to the rancher, and he grows corn and lets the cows come over and eat it. There's all kinds of things that you could think of here that the two people might get together and agree on that some government bureaucracy is never going to come up with. So the Coase idea is that as long as there aren't transaction costs, as long as it's not expensive, if you negotiate agreement, as long as it's not expensive to keep that agreement, then the market can handle this, right? We already talked when we talked about some of the trade things that one of the problems with making a trade deal between the United States and Mexico or the United States and China is how do you enforce it? How do you make sure that contract is enforced? And those contracts have very high transaction costs because you need a bureaucracy basically to make sure that it's enforced. What Coase is saying is if that's not the case, if you have a situation where it's easy to enforce the agreement, then you should let the two parties negotiate it, work it out without the government having to be involved. Okay? The market can solve that externality if there aren't transaction costs. All right? And that includes all resource allocation. All right? Now, let me give you an example of this. Right? What the Coase Theorem says is if you have a resource, it doesn't matter who owns it. It'll still be used in the optimal way. It shouldn't matter who owns it. The outcomes of whatever you do should be the same. So many years ago in sports, in the 60s and into the 70s and the 50s and the 40s and 30s, but whatever. When a player went to a sports team, you went to the NFL, you went to the NBA, you went wherever, you basically had a lifetime agreement with that team. The team owned your contract as long as you played. Something called the reserve clause. And we don't need to go into that, but you were stuck with your team. Okay? Player salaries were so low that most players in professional sports had an outside job. They had a second job. The quarterback of the Denver Broncos in the 60s was a chemical engineer on the side. Okay? So everybody had other jobs or they owned a restaurant or something. The teams were making a lot of money off these players. So what people did was they analyzed. They knew there were these court cases, and everybody knew that free agency was going to come, that pretty soon the players were going to be able to decide for themselves what team they wanted to play for. They'd be able to explore the market and talk to every team, and they wouldn't be stuck. The Coase Theorem says, and there's a whole bunch of articles written about this, the Coase Theorem says that the players should already be playing for the team that values them the most. If the Dodgers have a player and they don't think he's that good, but the Cubs really think that guy is good, then the Dodgers should have traded that player to the Cubs and gotten value in return, and the Cubs will be better off and the Dodgers will be better off. Everybody will be better off. Okay? The player could be better off because he's valued more. So all of the predictions about what would happen when free agency came in sports was that player salaries would jump up dramatically and players would make a lot more money. But they wouldn't change teams because they should already be on the team, the best team, the team that likes them the best. Okay? That instead of the player having a low salary and the team profiting from the player will get what the team actually thinks they're worth. And so they'll still be with the team they were, they'll just get paid more. Well, that turned out to be totally wrong. Okay? All of the players, large numbers of the players, changed teams and continue to change teams. And so there's these questions about when this Coase Theorem applies, but it's a cool theorem. All right. The second thing we can do is just pass a law. So we can pass a law that says you have to clean out your tailings pond every night, and if you don't, there's a $100 million fine. Well, that's pretty much going to make me clean out my tailings pond, right? Yeah. European countries have basically banned gasoline cars, right? You won't be able to sell a gasoline-powered car in Europe in about 10 years. You won't be able to buy one. Okay? The United States, we haven't done that, but in Europe, there won't be. You'll have to buy an electric car after about 2030. Okay? They'll still have, the old cars will still be around and there'll still be oil and stuff, but after 2030. How do you get people to adopt clean technology? Well, one easy way is just to pass a law and say, look, you got to have an electric car. All right? We're going the other way, actually. How they did this in Europe was they didn't pass a law that said you have to buy an electric car. They said that cars have to get at least 90 miles to a gallon after 2030. Well, the only way to build a car that gets over 90 miles to a gallon is to make it an electric. Okay? So that forces everybody to go to an electric. We're doing the opposite in the United States. The Trump administration went the other way and said, we're lowering the gas mileage requirement for cars in the United States. Okay? But you can pass a law to try to deal with an externality. If you think car pollution is a problem, get the cars off the street.